He thought ending a secret online affair would bring peace. But 3 months later, his family home was in flames. No break-in, no suspect, just one message left behind. You'll regret this. Stay to the end. The truth burns deeper than the fire itself. March 18th, 2022, 3:14 in the morning. The suburbs of Harper County, Georgia, slept under a low mist. On Pine Hollow Drive, the world was silent until a sharp explosion of glass shattered the calm. Within seconds, orange lights surged across the night sky as flames devoured the Miles family home. The first emergency call came from Doris Lang, a neighbor who lived across the street. Her voice shook as she whispered into the phone, "It is Aaron's house. It is burning." She kept her camera rolling while trying to keep her breath steady. The footage would later show the fire spreading impossibly fast, as though the night itself had caught fire. By 3:21, the first fire engines arrived. Sirens screamed down the narrow street, red lights flashing across driveways and mailboxes. Firefighters leapt out, shouting instructions to one another. "Back entry! Move in!" one yelled over the roar of the flames. The heat was so intense that the front windows burst outward, showering shards of glass across the lawn. Across the street, a man stood barefoot on the pavement, wrapped in a blanket. It was Aaron Miles, his face smeared with soot, his eyes fixed on the inferno. He whispered the names of his family over and over, each one quieter than the last. Tessa, Noah, Lily. When paramedics reached him, his hands were shaking so badly that he could not hold the cup of water they offered. "Was anyone else inside?" a firefighter asked. Aaron swallowed hard before answering. "My wife. My kids. I was asleep on the couch. I woke up and it was smoke everywhere." His voice cracked, yet what disturbed investigators was not his grief, but the stillness behind it, an eerie calm that did not fit the chaos around him. By 3:45, the entire structure had collapsed. When the final flames died, the Miles residence was reduced to a skeleton of charred beams. Firefighters moved through the wreckage carefully, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. Then one voice broke the silence. "We found them." Near what had once been the hallway to the children's bedrooms, 3 bodies were discovered together. Tessa Miles, 38 years old, and her 2 children, Noah, 10, and Lily, 7. None of them had reached a doorway. None had survived. As the sky turned pale, the sound of crackling embers faded into a steady hiss. Detective Naomi Pierce, a veteran of the Harper County Major Crimes Unit, arrived just after sunrise. She stood still among the ash, watching the last curls of smoke rise into the air. She had seen dozens of fires, some tragic, some accidental, but this one felt different. The burn lines were too precise, the pattern too deliberate. "Fires tell stories," she murmured to a colleague beside her. "And this one is lying." Investigators marked the ground with small orange flags where unusual residues were found. The burn traces formed 3 clear points of origin, one near the staircase, one in the living room, and one beside the hallway wall. The air smelled faintly of petroleum solvent, not something found in most homes. Whoever lit this fire had known exactly how to make it spread. At 6:20, a forensic technician called out that they had recovered an object near the remains of the living room couch. It was a smartphone, half melted, its glass fractured but still faintly glowing. When they managed to power it on, one message appeared on the screen, sent 2 nights earlier. The sender's name was Mara C. The text read simply, "You will regret this." By 8 o'clock, reporters had gathered behind the yellow tape. Neighbors stood together in disbelief, clutching blankets and mugs of coffee. One woman told an officer, "They were good people. Tessa was a nurse at the county hospital. Aaron always waved when he left for work. I cannot believe this." Detective Pierce walked away from the noise and focused on the man sitting in the back of the ambulance. Aaron's clothes were torn, his face pale. When she approached, he looked up briefly, his eyes hollow. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said gently. "But I need to ask, was there anyone who might want to harm you or your family?" Aaron hesitated. "No one. We kept to ourselves. I cannot imagine who would do this." Pierce studied his expression. "Do you know a woman named Mara Collins?" For the first time since the fire began, he looked startled. "Maybe. I think I talked to her online. A while ago." He stopped, as if realizing he had said too much. The detective made a note in her small notebook. "Knows Mara Collins." Hesitated. By mid-morning, laboratory samples confirmed the accelerant was not standard gasoline but a compound more common in industrial paint removers, something few people would have access to without planning. The fire had been constructed like a blueprint, its paths measured and efficient. As the coroner's team prepared to remove the remains, Pierce stood on the wet pavement, watching sunlight filter through the smoke. She could hear Aaron's voice behind her, faint and trembling. "I should have said something sooner." Pierce turned, looking at him wrapped in a gray blanket, sitting motionless on the curb. In her mind, a thought formed with chilling clarity. He is not just a husband who lost his family. He is the thread that will lead to whoever set this fire. The flames were gone, but the story they had started, the one about guilt, secrecy, and vengeance, was only beginning. 6 months before the fire, the Miles family looked like the kind of people others quietly envied. Their home on Pine Hollow Drive had a white fence, trimmed hedges, and a tire swing that creaked gently in the afternoon breeze. On weekends, laughter spilled from their backyard, children chasing each other through sprinklers while the smell of grilled chicken drifted over to the neighbors. From the outside, they seemed like the portrait of peace. But inside, that peace had been thinning for a long time. Tessa Miles, 38 years old, worked as a nurse at Harper County Medical Center. Her co-workers admired her steadiness. She was the kind of person who stayed late when shifts ran long and who always remembered her patients' birthdays. She loved her family fiercely but had grown tired in a way that sleep could not fix. "Sometimes," she told her sister Emily, "I feel like a single mother who just happens to share a mortgage." Her husband, Aaron Miles, 40 years old, was a financial advisor for a mid-sized firm downtown. He dressed sharply, smiled easily, and had the sort of calm tone that clients trusted with their money. To the neighbors, he seemed dependable, quiet, perhaps a little reserved. But at home, that calm had turned into silence. In the early years of their marriage, Aaron and Tessa had filled the house with noise, music on Sunday mornings, movie nights on the couch, small arguments that always ended with laughter. Yet by the autumn of 2021, those moments had faded. Dinner became routine. Their words grew fewer, their smiles rarer. Each evening followed the same script. Tessa set the table, checked the time, and listened for the sound of his car in the driveway. 8:15, 8:30. By 9, she would wrap the leftovers and wash the dishes alone. When Aaron finally walked through the door, he would loosen his tie, avoid her eyes, and mumble something about a late client. She would nod. He would vanish into his office. The distance between them felt like another wall inside the house. To their children, it seemed normal. Noah, 10 years old, buried himself in science projects, and Lily, 7, clung to her mother's legs, asking why Daddy was always tired. Tessa smiled for them, but her eyes carried a dull sadness that even the children noticed. At the hospital, she confided in her friend Janet, another nurse. "He is still kind," Tessa said one evening during a late shift, "but it feels like we are living side by side instead of together." Janet offered a sympathetic shrug. "Maybe he just needs space. Men hide when they are struggling." Tessa had nodded, but she knew it was more than that. It was not anger, it was absence. Meanwhile, Aaron's colleagues began to notice that he stayed longer at the office. The light in his cubicle often glowed long after everyone else had gone home. When asked why, he laughed it off. Deadlines never end. But the truth was simpler and darker. He was avoiding home. Inside those quiet hours, Aaron's loneliness grew heavier. The stillness of his office became a place to hide. He scrolled through news feeds and online forums to distract himself from guilt. He told himself he was just tired, that the distance with Tessa was temporary, that he still loved her even if he did not know how to talk to her anymore. That was when he stumbled across a forum titled Mind Space Reflections. It was a small online community for people dealing with anxiety and burnout. The front page carried posts about grief, overwork, and emotional exhaustion. Aaron clicked on one thread called When Home Stops Feeling Like Home. He did not comment. He just read. Then a message appeared in his inbox. "You sound tired," the sender wrote. "Are you all right?" The username was Mara51. Aaron stared at the screen for a moment. He almost ignored it, but something about the tone, gentle, human, made him reply. "Just tired from work. Trying to keep everything together." She responded quickly. "It is never just work. What is really weighing on you?" That first conversation lasted 10 minutes. The next one lasted an hour. By the end of the week, it had become a routine. Every night around 10:30, after Tessa and the children were asleep, Aaron would log back on. There she would be, waiting with kind words and long paragraphs. At first, he convinced himself it was harmless. She seemed older, safe, someone who simply understood the feeling of being invisible. She told him she lived in Brenton, Georgia, that she was 51 years old, a retired caregiver who had lost her husband years earlier. "Grief," she wrote once, "does not disappear. It changes shape." That sentence lingered with him. Their messages turned into something else, a rhythm that filled the silence Tessa had left. Aaron began to feel seen again. When Mara told him, "You remind me of someone who tried too hard to be perfect," it hit a nerve. He started waiting for her messages. At home, Tessa noticed. Some nights, she woke around 2 in the morning to find the glow of his phone in the hallway. He would sit on the couch, whispering, smiling faintly. When she asked, "Who are you talking to?" he would answer, "A client with a financial emergency." She wanted to believe him. She wanted peace more than confrontation. The next morning, she wrote in her journal, "I think my husband loves a screen more than me." By November, the marriage existed mostly in gestures. They still said goodnight. They still went to church on Sundays. But they no longer held hands, no longer looked at each other long enough to notice the change. When Christmas came, the tree in their living room was decorated only by the children. Aaron spent most of the evening in his office, supposedly preparing client portfolios. What he was really doing was typing long messages to Mara about how lost he felt. That night, as the children slept, he told her, "Sometimes I think I do not know who I am anymore." She replied, "Then let me remind you." It was a sentence that sounded kind, but it was the beginning of something far darker. For Tessa, that December marked the first time she truly feared her marriage was slipping away. For Aaron, it was the month he began trading guilt for comfort. And for Mara, sitting miles away behind a glowing screen, it was the start of an attachment that would soon burn its way from the digital world into real life. The Miles family looked perfect from the street, but inside their walls, silence was spreading, quiet and invisible, like the first spark of a fire waiting for air. By the beginning of the new year, the late-night messages between Aaron Miles and Mara Collins had become the one constant rhythm in Aaron's life. He no longer checked sports scores or the news before bed. Instead, he waited for the small notification that signaled her presence. Every night at around 10:30, his phone would light up and the first message would appear. "Are you awake?" Aaron told himself. It was nothing serious. She was a friend, someone who listened when no one else did. Yet beneath that excuse, a subtle dependency had already taken root. Mara said she lived in Brenton, Georgia, a small town about an hour away from Harper County. She told him she used to work as a caregiver until arthritis forced her to stop. Her husband, she claimed, had passed away a decade earlier, leaving her alone in a quiet house filled with memories. "Grief never leaves," she wrote once. "It just changes shape until it fits the space you give it." That kind of honesty disarmed him. Aaron began sharing things he never told anyone: his exhaustion at work, his guilt for being distant, his fear that he had somehow failed as a husband and father. Mara always knew exactly what to say. "You're not failing," she typed. "You're just tired of being strong for everyone else." Their conversations soon stretched past midnight. What began as empathy turned into intimacy, messages that moved from comfort to curiosity. She asked how he felt when he looked at his wife, what he missed about the early days of marriage, what he wished someone would say to him when he came home. The questions were careful but deliberate, each one peeling back another layer. When Aaron mentioned that his favorite part of the day used to be hearing his children laugh, she responded, "That kind of sound is what keeps a house alive. Do you still hear it?" He hesitated before typing, "Not as much." Then came her reply, "Maybe your home stopped being a place where you are seen." From that moment, Mara's words began to echo in his head even when his phone was silent. At work, his co-workers noticed the change. He smiled more often, but it was the distracted smile of a man living somewhere else in his mind. He began using his lunch breaks to scroll through their conversations, rereading old messages as though they were proof that someone still understood him. At home, Tessa could sense something shifting. She started to feel like she was living with a stranger, a man who existed in the same space but whose thoughts were always miles away. When she asked him one evening, "Is everything all right?" he answered too quickly, "I'm fine." That night, after putting the children to bed, she walked past his office and saw the faint glow of his laptop. His shoulders were relaxed, his head tilted slightly forward. He was smiling in a way she had not seen in years. She paused at the doorway, wanting to speak, but too afraid to interrupt the only happiness she had seen on his face in months. She went back to bed alone. Meanwhile, Mara began to blur the line between friendship and something else. She sent him photos, nothing inappropriate, just fragments of her life. A cup of coffee beside a worn novel, a sunset through her window, a potted plant she said reminded her of resilience. In return, Aaron sent her pictures of his desk, his morning commute, and once, without thinking, a quick selfie from his office. "Now I can see the man behind the words," she wrote. "You look like someone who carries too much." That compliment stayed with him for days. By February, the messages had moved from the forum to private chat. Mara said she wanted their conversations to be less public. He agreed, telling himself it was for privacy, not secrecy. Yet every new message pulled him further from his real life. When he came home late one evening, Tessa greeted him at the door with a small smile. "Dinner's in the oven," she said softly. He nodded but walked straight past her, mumbling something about work. As she watched him disappear down the hall, she whispered to herself, "I do not even recognize him anymore." At the same time, Aaron was in his office, staring at a message that read, "Some people stop seeing what is right in front of them. I never will." He replied, "You make it sound like I matter again." She wrote back instantly, "You do." That night, he sat in the dark for a long time, phone still glowing in his hand. The comfort he felt came with a quiet guilt that settled deep in his stomach. He told himself it was harmless, that he was not cheating, just talking. But emotional infidelity does not announce itself. It creeps in disguised as understanding. As their conversations grew longer, the tone began to change. Mara's affection turned possessive. When he missed a message, she would write, "You disappeared on me." When he took too long to reply, she added, "I guess I should stop expecting you to care." He would rush to answer, typing apologies he did not owe. Mara's empathy, once soothing, became a kind of leash. Still, Aaron could not let go. Every time he thought about stopping, loneliness filled the space she left. Every word from her felt like warmth in a house that had gone cold. Meanwhile, Tessa kept trying to reach her husband through small gestures, packing his favorite lunch, sending short messages during work hours, even suggesting a family trip to the mountains. Each time, he found a reason to postpone. He told himself he would fix things eventually. First, he just needed to figure out what he truly felt. But by then, what he felt was no longer love. It was dependency. And for Mara Collins, dependency was the first step toward possession. When Aaron finally logged off one night without saying goodbye, his screen filled with her last message before midnight. "Do not forget who listens when no one else does." He closed his laptop, unaware that the same message would later echo through an interrogation room, read aloud by a detective trying to understand how words could burn a life to the ground. By late February, Aaron Miles no longer thought of his nightly conversations with Mara Collins as a distraction. They had become a ritual, something he both relied on and resented. Every evening after the children fell asleep and the television went silent, he would drift into his office, close the door, and unlock the one place where he still felt seen: his messages with her. What had started as support and understanding was changing shape. Mara's tone grew softer in words, but sharper underneath. She began asking about Tessa more often, not with curiosity, but with challenge. "Does she even notice when you come home late?" she typed one night. "Does she ever ask if you are happy?" Aaron hesitated before replying. "We are both just tired. Life gets heavy." Her next message came quickly. Tired is what people say when they have already stopped trying. He stared at those words for a long time before typing, "You do not know her." But she ignored that line, writing instead, "You deserve peace, Aaron. Everyone does. Maybe you just have to choose it." He should have stopped reading, should have logged off right then, but the truth was, he wanted to believe her. It was easier than facing his own failures. As the weeks passed, Mara learned everything about him. His morning routine, his favorite songs, even the smell of the coffee brand he used. She remembered every small detail he shared, repeating them back in her late-night messages. "You said you love the sound of rain on your porch," she wrote. "I think about that when I cannot sleep." The way she said it made him feel important again. Seen. Needed. At the same time, his wife felt him slipping further away. Tessa noticed how often his phone stayed face down on the table and how he began stepping outside to take calls that used to happen in front of her. She told her sister Emily, "It feels like he is living another life, and I am not invited." Emily suggested counseling. Tessa laughed bitterly. He would have to talk for that to work. When Aaron arrived home the next evening, she met him at the door with dinner already packed into the refrigerator. "We can heat it later," she said quietly. "I just want to talk." He nodded, but looked past her toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted, Tess. Tomorrow, all right." But tomorrow never came. That night at 11:15, his phone vibrated with a new message. "You do not have to explain why you stay. I know what guilt feels like." He typed back before thinking, "You talk like a therapist." Her reply came seconds later. "No, I talk like someone who has been left." Those words stopped him cold. For the first time, he saw something in her tone that unsettled him, an undercurrent of pain too deep to ignore, too heavy to fix. Yet even that realization did not push him away. It only made him feel responsible for her feelings. That is how emotional control often begins, through sympathy that turns into obligation. By early March, Tessa tried to reach him one more time. She booked a long weekend trip to the coast, hoping the change of scenery might reconnect them. Aaron declined, saying he could not take time off work. When she pressed, he snapped, "Do you want me to lose my job?" She stared at him, stunned. "I just want my husband back." He left the room without answering. At the office, colleagues began noticing his distraction. He missed deadlines, forgot meetings, and stared into space between calls. His assistant once asked jokingly, "Who keeps you up so late, boss?" Aaron smiled faintly and said, "Someone who listens." He meant it as a joke, but it did not sound like one. That weekend, Mara asked if he believed in second chances. When he said he did, she answered, "Then why keep living in a place that breaks you?" The question echoed through him all day. He walked through the house that night watching his family sleep and wondered when his love had turned into duty. He did not realize that the more he questioned his marriage, the more power Mara gained over him. By now, their conversations had taken on a rhythm that mimicked intimacy. Good mornings, check-ins, late-night confessions. She began saying things like, "I pray for you," and "You make the silence feel kind again." Those words made him feel chosen, even blessed. Yet beneath that tenderness, there was possession. When he took too long to reply, her messages changed. "I guess I mean less now. Maybe you just needed someone until you felt better." He would apologize every time, desperate to smooth the tension. It was no longer about affection, it was about keeping the peace. Meanwhile, Tessa was documenting the cracks she saw but could not explain. In her journal, dated March 5th, she wrote, "He smiles at his phone, not at me. If love fades quietly, this is what it sounds like." That same night, Aaron sat in his car outside the house, gripping his phone. He typed and erased the same message to Mara several times. "We need to stop." Each time he reached for courage, guilt stopped him. When he finally sent it, it was just one line. "I cannot do this anymore." For 3 minutes, there was no reply. Then the screen lit up. "I understand, but remember, not everything ends because you say it does." He locked his phone and stared into the dark. The next morning, Tessa made pancakes for the children while Aaron sat quietly at the table. She smiled at him, tired but hopeful. "It is good to have breakfast together again," she said. He nodded, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Upstairs, his phone buzzed once more. When he checked, the message from Mara read, "Peace is fragile, Aaron. You cannot keep it by pretending." He closed the message and deleted the entire thread, telling himself that deleting was the same as ending. It was not. Across the state in Brenton, Mara stared at her own screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she whispered to herself, "He thinks this is over." Then she began typing a new message, one that would never reach him but would change everything. If peace cannot stay, then fire will. The days that followed were thick with silence. Aaron Miles told himself he had finally done the right thing. He had ended it, deleted the messages, blocked the number. For the first time in months, he tried to live as though Mara Collins had never existed. But guilt does not vanish just because the phone is silent. It lingers in the air, waiting for weakness. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then, on the third evening, while Aaron was finishing dinner with Tessa and the children, his phone buzzed once. The screen displayed an unknown number and one message. "You will regret this." He froze. The words were simple, but something about their tone made his pulse race. He deleted it immediately, telling himself it was probably nothing, an old contact, a wrong number, a coincidence. Still, a faint dread settled in the back of his mind. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, he sat awake in bed staring at the ceiling. Tessa slept beside him, peaceful for the first time in weeks. He wanted to wake her, to tell her everything, to confess the messages, the late nights, the guilt that was eating him alive. But every time he pictured the look on her face, shame swallowed the words before they could leave his mouth. He whispered into the darkness, "It is over," as if saying it aloud would make it true. But it was not over. The next morning, his colleague Marcus stopped by his desk at work. "Hey man," Marcus said lightly, "did you delete your social media? I tried tagging you in a post, but your profile is gone." Aaron frowned. "No. Maybe the app glitched." He opened his phone. The password prompt appeared, but his usual code did not work. Every attempt ended with the same message: invalid credentials. When he tried resetting it, the recovery email failed. Each linked account, email, social media, even his work calendar, showed the same pattern: unauthorized attempts from an unfamiliar address located in Brenton, Georgia. His stomach dropped. Only one person had ever mentioned living there. He called his service provider, changed passwords, and set up new recovery options, but the fear remained. It was not just about privacy, it was the feeling of being watched. That evening, he drove home through a steady drizzle. Tessa was in the kitchen helping Lily with homework, while Noah built a tower of blocks in the living room. The sound of their laughter should have comforted him, but instead it felt fragile, like something that could disappear at any moment. He sat at the table, forcing himself to join the conversation. When Tessa smiled and said, "It is nice having you home before dark again," he managed to smile back. For the first time in months, she believed they might be healing. After dinner, while everyone was cleaning up, Aaron's phone vibrated again. Another message from an unknown number. "Sleep tight, Aaron." No punctuation, no explanation. He deleted it instantly, heart pounding. He wanted to tell Tessa, but how could he explain a message from a woman she did not know existed? How could he admit that his secret mistake was now bleeding into their lives? That night he double-checked the locks before bed. He even unplugged the Wi-Fi router, as though disconnecting the internet could somehow cut the invisible thread that tied him to Mara. In Brenton, less than an hour's drive away, a security camera at a 24-hour convenience store captured a woman in a black hooded jacket. She walked to the counter, placed 2 lighter bottles and a pack of gum on the counter, paid in cash, and left without speaking. Her car, a dark Toyota Camry, idled outside under the rain. The timestamp on the footage read, March 17th, 10:14 p.m. She was calm, purposeful, almost serene. The following morning, March 18th, Tessa woke early to prepare breakfast. She hummed quietly as the children got ready for school. Aaron sat at the table, exhausted but trying to seem normal. She smiled, pouring coffee into his mug. "You look like you finally slept," she said. He smiled weakly, trying to start fresh. The words felt good to say, but even as he said them, something inside him whispered that it was too late. Around 9 o'clock, while checking his emails, Aaron noticed another alert from his bank, a failed login attempt from an unfamiliar device. He called customer service immediately, changed every password again, and froze his accounts. The representative on the line asked if he wanted to report possible fraud. Aaron almost laughed. Fraud was the least of his worries. He closed his laptop and sat in silence for a long time. At lunch, Marcus stopped by his desk again. "You all right, man? You look like you have seen a ghost." Aaron forced a smile. "Just tired. I think I caught a cold." But there was no illness, only fear. That night, as a storm rolled in across Harper County, Aaron sat in his car outside his house, rain sliding down the windshield in streaks of silver. He stared at his phone, half expecting it to buzz again. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. He began to relax. Then, just as he reached for the door handle, the screen lit up one last time. It was an email, sent from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "Thank you for teaching me what love feels like." No message body, no attachments, just the line itself. He deleted it, turned off the phone, and went inside. Upstairs, Tessa was already asleep. He lay beside her, eyes open, listening to the thunder roll in the distance. Each flash of lightning painted the room white for an instant before fading back to darkness. He told himself it was just paranoia, that Mara had no reason to hurt anyone. She had only wanted to be understood. He did not know that at that exact hour, along the highway outside Brenton, a black Toyota Camry was heading north. Its headlights were off. The rain swallowed the sound of its tires as it merged onto the interstate toward Harper County. Inside, behind the wheel, a woman's voice whispered softly to herself, "He will understand soon." March 18th, 2022. The air over Harper County, Georgia, hung heavy with rain. The storm had quieted, leaving behind a fog that blurred the streetlights along Pine Hollow Drive. Inside the Miles home, the world was still. Tessa had tucked the children into bed early. Aaron, exhausted, had fallen asleep on the couch, his phone powered off on the coffee table beside him. For the first time in months, the house felt peaceful, the kind of peace that comes right before a storm returns. At 2:48 in the morning, a black Toyota Camry turned onto Pine Hollow Drive. Its headlights remained off as it crept to a stop 1 block from the Miles residence. Security footage from a nearby porch camera later captured only a faint silhouette stepping out of the vehicle. The person carried something in each hand, a small canister and a plastic bag. Rain fell lightly, masking every sound. Inside the house, Tessa stirred. A faint creak echoed from the porch, but she dismissed it as wind. At 3:14, the first ignition point sparked. Investigators would later determine that accelerant had been poured in 3 places, near the front entryway, under the staircase, and at the base of the living room wall. Within seconds, the liquid caught flame. The fire moved fast, unnaturally fast, feeding on the air like it had been waiting for this moment. The smoke detectors screamed. Aaron woke coughing, confusion clouding his mind. He stumbled from the couch, eyes burning, calling out, "Tessa, the kids!" But every direction was fire. The hallway leading to the bedrooms glowed red. The heat hit him like a wall. He ran toward the stairs, but a section of the ceiling collapsed, forcing him back. The living room window shattered, showering him with glass. He scrambled through the opening, barefoot, his hands cut and bleeding, gasping for air as he landed in the yard. He turned back toward the house, screaming their names. "Tessa! Noah! Lily!" His voice broke into hoarse cries, swallowed by the roar of flames. Neighbors began pouring out of their homes, faces pale, voices trembling as they called for help. A woman's phone camera caught the house fully engulfed, the fire pulsing with a strange rhythm, as if controlled. At 3:21, the first fire truck arrived. Sirens sliced through the wet air. Firefighters rushed in with axes and hoses, shouting over the chaos. One tried to enter through the back, but the floor had already given way. Another shouted, "Multiple points! This is spreading too clean!" The fire did not behave like an accident. It moved with purpose. Aaron, wrapped in a blanket by paramedics, watched as the structure he had called home became a furnace. He shook uncontrollably, whispering, "They were just sleeping. They were just sleeping." By the time the blaze was contained, the house was gone. The walls were blackened ribs, the roof a heap of steaming ash. When firefighters entered what remained, they found 3 bodies close together near the hallway leading to the children's rooms. Detective Naomi Pierce arrived before dawn. Rain dripped from her coat as she stood at the edge of the property, staring at the ruins. She had seen dozens of fires in her career, but the scene before her was too deliberate. The burn lines were symmetrical, the accelerant patterns almost surgical. She crouched near the edge of the driveway where the smell of gasoline still lingered. Her instinct whispered what no one else had yet said aloud. This was not a tragedy, it was an operation. At 6 o'clock, while the rain turned to mist, Naomi joined the lead fire inspector inside the remains of the living room. The inspector pointed toward a blackened patch of floor that shimmered slightly under the light. "That is chemical residue," he said. "Not standard fuel. Someone planned this." Naomi nodded slowly. "Find out what kind. Get me every surveillance feed from a 5-mile radius." Outside, Aaron sat in the back of an ambulance, his skin pale, his hands trembling. When Naomi approached, he looked at her with red, unfocused eyes. "They are gone," he whispered. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. "We will find out how this happened." Aaron swallowed hard. "I fell asleep downstairs. I woke up, and it was everywhere. I tried to reach them." His words dissolved into sobs. Naomi crouched beside him. "Did you see anyone outside? Any car parked nearby?" He shook his head. "No, just smoke. It was dark." She hesitated before asking, "Aaron, does the name Mara Collins mean anything to you?" He froze. His jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because your phone was recovered inside," Naomi said quietly. "And there was a message from her, sent 2 nights ago. It said, 'You will regret this.'" He stared at her, his face draining of color. "I told her it was over. I told her I needed to fix my marriage." Naomi's expression remained calm. "And what did she say to that?" His answer came out as a whisper. "She said, I would understand when peace was gone." Naomi stood up, rain dripping from her sleeves. "We will need to speak again at the station," she said softly. Behind them, the fire inspector called out, "Detective, you should see this." They walked toward what had been the staircase. The charred wood had melted into the floor, exposing metal strips that glistened faintly in the light. "This was timed," the inspector said. 3 separate ignition points, same chemical signature. Someone coordinated it. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Then this is not arson for insurance or revenge. This is something else." The coroner's report arrived by mid-morning. None of the victims showed significant smoke inhalation. The cause of death had occurred before the fire reached full strength. That detail hit Naomi like a hammer. It meant whoever had done this had been inside the house before the first spark. As the sun rose over Harper County, the neighborhood filled with reporters. They spoke of a loving family gone overnight, a father left alive by chance. But inside the precinct, detectives no longer spoke of coincidence. At 9 o'clock, Naomi gathered her team in the briefing room. On the screen behind her, a satellite map of Harper County glowed faintly. She pointed to a small dot on the edge of Pine Hollow Drive. A camera from a traffic light here captured a dark sedan parked at 2:48 a.m. It matches a vehicle registered to Mara Collins, 51, residing in Brenton. The room fell silent. She had motive, Naomi said. She had access, and she had time. Her partner, Detective James Soto, frowned. "Do you think she came here to scare him?" Naomi shook her head. "No, this was not about fear. This was about control." Outside, gray clouds gathered again, and the smell of burned wood lingered through the neighborhood. Reporters called it a tragedy. Investigators called it homicide. For Aaron Miles, sitting alone in a hospital gown with soot still under his fingernails, it was neither. It was punishment for a secret he thought no one would ever discover, and for a goodbye that someone refused to accept. The fire was over, but the story it had started was just beginning to burn. By sunrise the next morning, the Miles family fire had become national news. Headlines called it a suburban nightmare. A family of 4 torn apart by an inferno with no apparent cause. But behind the media's sympathy, detectives inside Harper County's precinct were chasing a single name that appeared again and again: Mara Collins. Detective Naomi Pierce sat in the evidence room surrounded by reports, photos, and phone logs. The faint smell of ash still clung to her jacket from the night before. She replayed the voicemail found on Aaron's phone, the one recovered half-melted from the living room floor. It was short, only 6 seconds long, but hauntingly clear. A woman's voice whispering, "You will regret this." Naomi had heard countless threats in her career, but this one was different. The tone wasn't rage. It was conviction. Calm, steady, and deliberate, like someone reciting a prayer. At 9 o'clock that morning, a forensics technician entered with new data. "We pulled cell tower records," he said, placing a file on her desk. Mara's phone pinged 3 blocks from the Miles home at 2:48 a.m., 26 minutes before the first 911 call. Naomi's jaw tightened. That puts her here before the fire started. Her partner, Detective James Soto, leaned over the table. "Do we have visuals?" "Traffic cam caught a black Toyota Camry leaving the neighborhood at 3:07, the technician replied. "License plate matches hers." Naomi nodded slowly. She stayed just long enough to watch it burn. By mid-afternoon, the team traced Mara's vehicle south along the interstate toward Valdosta, then further into northern Florida. A gas station clerk recalled seeing her around 4 in the morning, alone, calm, wearing a dark hoodie. She paid in cash for fuel and coffee, leaving behind a receipt time-stamped only hours after the tragedy. Naomi looked up from the file. "She's not running. She's waiting." Meanwhile, Aaron was still at Grady Memorial Hospital, being treated for smoke inhalation. When Naomi visited, he sat by the window, staring at nothing. His voice was hollow when he spoke. "I never thought she'd come here. I thought ending it was enough." Naomi pulled up a chair. "Tell me about her." He hesitated, eyes wet. "She was kind at first. Gentle. She said she understood me when no one else did. I told myself it was just conversation, but she made it feel like something real." "And when you ended it?" Naomi asked. "She said I'd taken peace away from her," he whispered. "I thought it was just heartbreak. I didn't think she'd mean it literally." Naomi wrote that line down in her notebook. Taken peace away. The same word from the note they'd found in the rubble. When peace leaves, fire enters. That night, a tip came from Jacksonville, Florida. A clerk at a small roadside motel reported a woman checking in under the name Mary Collins. Same age range, same car model parked behind the building. She had requested a ground-floor room and paid in cash. Naomi and Soto were on the road within an hour. When they arrived at dawn, the motel parking lot shimmered under a layer of dew. The Camry was there, dark paint streaked with soot and pollen. Its trunk was partially open. Inside, they found a half-empty gas can, latex gloves, and a funnel. The air smelled faintly of lighter fluid. A few minutes later, they approached room 12. The door was unlocked. Inside sat Mara Collins, her hair tied neatly, a notebook resting on her lap. She looked up as the detectives entered. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said softly. Naomi stayed calm. "Mara Collins, you're under arrest for the deaths of Tessa, Noah, and Lily Miles, and for the arson of their home." Mara didn't flinch as they read her rights. She only closed the notebook and whispered, "You do not have to shout. I know what this is." During interrogation, she remained eerily composed. She spoke politely, even smiling once or twice, as though she were recounting someone else's story. Naomi started carefully. "You were seen near the Miles home the night of the fire. Why were you there?" Mara tilted her head. "I wanted to say goodbye." "By setting a fire?" Her eyes softened. "By cleansing what was already dead." Naomi's voice hardened. "You killed 3 innocent people." Mara's expression didn't change. "I didn't kill them, Detective. They were gone long before I arrived. He just didn't notice." Naomi exchanged a glance with Soto. What do you mean by that? Mara leaned forward, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. Do you know what it's like to give someone your heart and watch them treat it like a passing thought? He made promises. He asked me to listen, and then he tried to erase me. You can't erase love. You can only burn what remains. Naomi stood, suppressing the anger that rose in her chest. You planned this. You waited until they were asleep. For the first time, Mara's calm cracked slightly. They were peaceful, she murmured. I made sure of that. The room fell silent. Hours later, the evidence team confirmed that the chemical residue from her car matched the accelerant used inside the Miles home. It was a petroleum solvent with trace additives, the same rare mixture found in professional paint thinner. Combined with the cell tower data, the surveillance footage, and her own words, the case was airtight. By the next morning, Mara Collins faced 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated arson, and 1 count of evidence tampering. When asked if she wanted to make a statement, she simply replied, "He said I brought him peace. I gave him peace." Naomi watched as officers escorted her to the holding cell. She turned to Soto and said quietly, "Some people destroy what they can't possess." He nodded grimly, and she made sure he'd never forget her. As Mara disappeared behind the metal door, Naomi glanced down at the notebook recovered from her motel room. On the first page, written in perfect handwriting, was a single line, "When peace leaves, fire enters." Naomi closed the book slowly. "This isn't over," she whispered. "Not for him." A week after the arrest of Mara Collins, Detective Naomi Pierce believed the case was nearing its end. The forensic evidence was strong, the motive clear, and the public outcry overwhelming. But something about the woman's eerie composure unsettled her. It was as if Mara had been waiting not to be caught, but to be recognized. Then came the first unexpected lead. A retired fire marshal from Augusta, Georgia, called Naomi after watching the news broadcast. "Detective," he said, "8 years ago, I worked a case that feels too similar. The victim's name was Daniel Briggs. It was ruled an electrical fire, but..." He paused. "There was a woman in the driveway that night. She told him, 'Don't treat me like I'm temporary.'" The words froze Naomi in place. They carried the same possessive tone, the same quiet threat. She reopened the old file. The photos were faded, but the burn patterns told a familiar story. 3 ignition points, accelerant residue, no forced entry. Briggs had perished inside his living room, alone. The case had been closed without suspect or follow-up. But now, Naomi noticed something buried deep in the report. A neighbor's statement describing a dark-haired woman who drove a black sedan. The signature was identical. Naomi took the file to her partner, Detective Soto. "This isn't the first time she's done this," she said. "We're looking at a pattern, not an accident." Within days, they uncovered 2 more fires. One in Savannah, 2018, another in Columbus, 2016. Both shared the same formula: a short-term relationship, a sudden breakup, a home burned to the ground. In each, the victims had once described the same type of woman, kind at first, then controlling, then gone. Naomi spread the photos across her desk. 3 cities, 3 men, 8 years, all roads led back to her. Soto flipped through the files, shaking his head. "So she's been doing this for years, and no one connected the dots." Naomi sighed. "Because each time she left no trace of herself. No social accounts, no fingerprints, no paper trail. She doesn't need to break in. She studies her victims until she knows their routines better than they do." A digital analyst from the cybercrime division confirmed what Naomi suspected. Using data recovered from Mara's confiscated laptop, they found records of old forum accounts under aliases: Healing Soul 51, Mary Ann Hope, and Loyal Heart. Each one traced back to advice threads about grief, loneliness, or emotional recovery. In every forum, she began as a listener, offering comfort, empathy, and late-night counsel. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Her messages began carrying subtle, possessive phrases. You belong where you are understood. People who love you should never make you wait. Peace is not shared. It's claimed. One post, dated July 2018, made Naomi's skin crawl. Under a thread titled, When Someone Moves On Too Soon, Mara had written, Peace is a place, not a person. When it leaves, fire must cleanse what remains. The exact line that appeared in her notebook. Dr. Renee Atkins, a behavioral psychologist consulted by the department, read through the transcripts and summarized what everyone now saw. Her relationships aren't about romance, she explained. They're about validation. She creates dependency through empathy, then enforces loyalty through guilt. When her emotional control is threatened, she restores it through destruction. Naomi nodded slowly. She turns abandonment into purification. That afternoon, detectives traveled to Savannah to re-interview witnesses from the 2018 fire. A building manager remembered a quiet woman who had visited the victim weeks before his death. She used to sit outside in her car for hours, he said, always calm, smiling even. Another tenant recalled overhearing an argument through the apartment wall. A man pleading and a woman replying in a low, even tone, Stop treating me like a lesson. I'm the reason you sleep. The phrase sent chills through Naomi. That's her language, she murmured. It's the same rhythm. Back in Harper County, prosecutors were building their case, layering the pattern of prior incidents to establish intent. Each new file added weight to the argument that the tragedy at the Miles home was not a crime of passion, but the final act of a practiced obsession. Late one night, Naomi sat alone in the precinct's evidence room, flipping through Mara's personal notebook again. Only one page had writing, but faint indentations marked several others, signs that earlier pages had been torn out. She tilted the notebook under the lamp, and faint impressions became visible. Partial sentences, almost invisible. He promised he'd never forget me. They think peace can return without me. Love is an echo, not a choice. Naomi closed the book, feeling a wave of unease. Mara's crimes weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed. Every sentence she'd ever written was a prelude to the next disaster. When Naomi shared her findings with the district attorney, he was stunned. So we're looking at a serial pattern, he said quietly, across multiple counties. Yes, Naomi replied, and every one of her victims thought they were her first. In court documents prepared for the upcoming trial, prosecutors listed a chilling statistic. 3 confirmed fires, 2 ruled accidental, 1, finally, proven deliberate. But internal notes hinted there might have been more. Small fires in nearby states, similar ignition methods, all coinciding with periods when Mara had briefly relocated. Dr. Atkins summarized it best during a pre-trial interview. She didn't just need to be remembered. She needed to be the final memory. As Naomi left the station that night, rain began to fall again, soft and persistent. She looked out across the empty parking lot and whispered to herself. She built her peace out of ashes. Behind her, the evidence board glowed under the fluorescent light. Across photos of burned homes and blurred surveillance stills, one line from the psychologist's report was circled in red ink. Her empathy is her weapon. And somewhere inside the county jail, Mara Collins sat alone in her cell, smiling faintly at the sound of distant thunder. She whispered, barely audible, "They're finally listening." June 12, 2023. The courthouse in Fulton County, Georgia, was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled every seat, microphones tangled in cables, cameras flashing like lightning each time the doors opened. For more than a year, the name Mara Collins had haunted headlines, the woman who burned for love. Now the country was here to witness justice. The clerk's voice broke through the tension. State of Georgia versus Mara Elaine Collins, case number 22F1093. Charges: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated arson. When Mara entered, the room fell silent. She wore a plain gray jumpsuit, her hair tied neatly, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly, every step deliberate, and sat beside her defense attorney as though she were arriving for an interview, not a trial. Across the courtroom, Aaron Miles sat in the front row, head bowed, hands clasped. He had aged years since the night of the fire. What had once been quiet guilt was now quiet endurance. He had come to hear the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Marcus Bell, began the opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his tone sharp and controlled, "this case is not about love, it is about possession. The defendant did not lose affection. She lost control, and she decided that if she could not have peace, no one else would." He played the recovered voicemail on a large monitor. Mara's voice filled the room. "You will regret this." 6 seconds of sound, followed by 6 seconds of stillness that felt longer than time itself. Bell turned to the jury. That was not heartbreak. That was a countdown. He showed the surveillance footage from the convenience store. Mara at the counter, paying in cash for lighter fluid and gloves, her face calm and steady. "This," he said, "is not the face of rage. It is the face of intent." Next came the fire investigator, Andrew Knox, who walked the jury through photos of the burned house. "We found 3 ignition points," he explained, "each linked by a petroleum-based solvent. The pattern was deliberate, not accidental." Bell leaned closer. "Could this have been the work of an amateur?" Knox shook his head. "No. Whoever did this knew how fire behaves." When Detective Naomi Pierce took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward. Her testimony was calm, factual, but her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. "We traced the defendant's phone near the crime scene minutes before the fire began," she said. "The same phone that later pinged in Florida during her flight south. Inside her car, we found a half-empty container of the same accelerant used in the Miles home." Bell nodded. "Detective, you also recovered a notebook from Miss Collins' motel room, did you not?" "Yes," Naomi replied, lifting a clear evidence sleeve. The first page contained a single line: "When peace leaves, fire enters." Murmurs rippled through the room. Then came the defense. Attorney Carla Mason rose, her voice controlled but pointed. "My client is not a monster," she said. "She is a woman who suffered profound loss and mental instability after years of isolation. Her relationship with Mr. Miles was emotional, not physical. And his sudden rejection triggered a psychological collapse, not a calculated murder." She turned toward the jury. "You will hear how Mr. Miles, a married man, nurtured this connection, encouraging affection, confessing loneliness, and then abandoning her when it became inconvenient. This tragedy began with emotional betrayal." The defense's argument landed uneasily. The jury's eyes shifted toward Aaron. He sat still, face pale. Mason continued. "Mr. Miles led her to believe there was something real between them. He may not have lit the match, but he struck the spark." Bell objected. "This courtroom is not here to measure heartbreak, counselor. It's here to measure murder." Judge Eleanor Harris sustained the objection. "Stick to facts, Ms. Mason." The defense then called Dr. Leonard Cole, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Mara. "Ms. Collins," he testified, "shows signs of attachment dysregulation. To her, rejection equals annihilation. She perceives emotional separation as death." The prosecutor pressed him. "Doctor, was she insane at the time of the crime?" "No," Dr. Cole replied. She knew what she was doing. She simply believed it was justified. That statement landed like thunder. When Aaron took the stand, the courtroom quieted again. His voice trembled as he described their first online exchanges, how harmless it all seemed. "She made me feel understood," he said. "I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just words." Belle asked softly, "Did you ever believe she might harm your family?" Aaron swallowed hard. "No. She talked about peace, about healing. I thought she wanted closure. I didn't realize she meant burning everything that reminded her of me." Then Mason rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Miles, did you ever say you cared for her?" Aaron nodded. "I said things I shouldn't have." "You told her she made you feel alive, didn't you?" He looked down. "Yes. And when you ended it, you did so abruptly." "I had to," he said, voice breaking. "My marriage was falling apart." Mason turned to the jury. "So after months of emotional intimacy, you severed contact without warning, and days later, your home was destroyed. Tragic? Yes. Premeditated murder, or the collapse of a broken mind?" Bell stood, his tone sharp. "You're not describing collapse, counselor. You're describing control." He gestured toward Mara. "Ms. Collins didn't lose her mind. She lost her audience, and instead of grief, she chose fire." On the 5th day of testimony, Bell revealed the most chilling evidence yet. An audio file found on Mara's phone, recorded hours before the fire. Her voice filled the courtroom. "Tonight, I set everything right. He'll understand now." The timestamp read March 15th, 2:02 a.m. The jurors exchanged horrified looks. Aaron closed his eyes, tears falling silently. After closing arguments, Judge Harris gave final instructions. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice shook slightly as he read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mara Elaine Collins, guilty on all counts." There was no gasp, no cry, only a collective exhale. Mara's reaction was unnerving. She smiled faintly, whispering something only she could hear. A courtroom reporter later wrote that her lips formed the words, "He's free now." Judge Harris's voice echoed through the chamber. For the murder of Tessa Miles, Noah Miles, and Lily Miles, and for the arson of their home, the court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck once. As officers led Mara away, she turned her head just enough to meet Aaron's eyes. A faint smile lingered as she whispered, "You'll think of me when it rains." He said nothing. He simply lowered his head as the courtroom emptied around him. Outside, reporters flooded the courthouse steps. The ADA spoke to the press, summarizing the case in one haunting line. "Technology didn't kill this family. A human heart did, a heart that mistook obsession for love." As the cameras flashed and thunder rolled in the distance, Aaron walked into the humid Georgia air, his face hidden beneath a gray hood. When a journalist shouted, "What will you do now, Mr. Miles?" he stopped only long enough to answer softly, "Try to live with what's left." That night, the courthouse lights dimmed, but the story refused to fade. Across every news station, one phrase repeated again and again: "When peace leaves, fire enters." 2 years passed after the verdict, but for Aaron Miles, time didn't feel linear anymore. It was as if the world had divided itself into 2 halves, before the fire and after. Every dawn was a reminder of what was gone, and every night was a battle against the silence that followed him home. It was August 2024. The Georgia summer thick and oppressive, yet Aaron wore long sleeves. The burn scars along his arms weren't visible, but they pulsed whenever the air turned humid. Phantom reminders of the night he escaped what his family didn't. That morning, he stood before a modest crowd inside a community center on Peachtree Avenue. The folding chairs were filled with survivors, people who had lost homes, loved ones, or themselves to violence, grief, or fire. The event poster behind him read, "Phoenix Outreach Foundation, Healing After the Flames." Aaron gripped the microphone with trembling fingers. "My name is Aaron Miles," he began, his voice soft but steady, "and I lost my wife and 2 children to a message I thought was harmless." The room went silent. No phones buzzed, no murmurs filled the air. Just the sound of his breathing. "I used to think talking to someone online was just words," he continued, "but words can become chains. I crossed a line I didn't even see, and the woman I thought understood me took everything that mattered." He paused, swallowing hard. "If anyone here believes a secret chat is harmless, please, think again. Some people don't want love. They want ownership, and by the time you realize the difference, it's too late." When he stepped down, no one clapped. A few approached him quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder or whispering, "Thank you." It wasn't applause he wanted. It was understanding. That night, he drove out to Harper County, parking near what used to be Pine Hollow Drive. The land was empty now, the ashes long cleared. A small memorial stone stood where his house once stood, engraved with 3 names, Tessa, Noah, Lily. And below them the words, "Love doesn't vanish, it becomes light." He knelt beside the stone and placed fresh lilies on the ground. For a long time he said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, "I hope you know I never stopped trying." He stayed until the streetlights flickered on, then stood and looked up at the dark sky. For the first time in 2 years, the sound of rain didn't make him flinch. In the month that followed, Aaron devoted himself fully to the Phoenix Foundation, working alongside first responders and burn survivors. He organized talks, raised money for displaced families, and became an advocate for online safety awareness. His story spread quietly. Not through tabloids, but through word of mouth, through people who understood what hidden pain looked like. When interviewed on Good Morning Atlanta, he said something that resonated across the country. "Emotional cheating is gasoline. You don't see the fire till it's already burning." He later published a short memoir titled One Wrong Message, blending his confession with lessons for others. It wasn't a bestseller, but counselors and support groups began using it as part of therapy programs for couples rebuilding trust. In the first chapter, he wrote, "I didn't meet danger in a dark alley. I met it in a message that felt like peace." Even Detective Naomi Pierce, now retired, kept a copy on her desk. In an interview for a documentary years later, she said, "That case stayed with me because it reminded me that evil doesn't always knock on your door. Sometimes it texts." The case of State vs. Collins went on to be studied in criminology and psychology programs across the nation. A chilling example of digital obsession escalating to real-world violence. Researchers called it the empathy trap, the point where comfort turns into control. In a television special marking the anniversary of the verdict, the host asked Naomi what she remembered most about the investigation. She replied, "Not the fire, not the evidence. What I remember most was how quiet she was, the kind of quiet that believes it's justified." When asked what became of Mara Collins, the answer was simple. She remained in the state penitentiary, rarely speaking. Occasionally she wrote letters, never to Aaron, never to the court, but to herself. Each one began with the same sentence: "Peace can't live where it isn't worshipped." Prison psychiatrists reported she maintained perfect composure, almost serene, as if convinced she had completed her purpose. But for Aaron, peace wasn't found in her silence. It was built from the ashes she left behind. On the 3rd anniversary of the fire, he attended a candlelight vigil for victims of domestic crimes. Dozens of flickering lights surrounded him, each flame small yet steady against the wind. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't talk about pain or punishment. He spoke about memory. "We can rebuild homes," he said quietly. But we can't rebuild people. What we can do is remember them, not with guilt, but with gratitude that they existed. As the candles swayed and the crowd bowed their heads, he whispered a final prayer under his breath. Rest in peace, my loves. You are the light that keeps me from burning out. The camera crew recording the vigil captured that moment. The way his face softened in the candlelight, the way the rain began to fall, yet every flame stayed lit. And when the documentary aired weeks later, it ended with his own closing narration. Sometimes a single message can destroy a life, but sometimes surviving that message means you get to become someone else's warning. If you're watching this, let my story be that warning. Think before you reply, because not every hello is harmless. The screen faded to black. A single line appeared beneath the final note of music. Dedicated to Tessa, Noah, and Lily, who turned darkness into light.